Hello, my name is Marcy Roth, and I'm the Executive Director and CEO at the World Institute on Disability. Throughout this four-part series, we will be having conversations with disability community leaders who are multiply marginalized and who bring insight into the intersections of ableism. We will be analyzing some of the issues that impact disabled people on a daily basis, including employment, healthcare, and how disability justice is being brought from vision to reality, interpersonally as well as on an international scale. I want to thank everyone who made such incredible contributions to bringing the adjustable table to life. We will acknowledge each of the individuals and corporate partners who contributed to this incredible effort at the end of each video. We're so excited to share these conversations, and it is truly my pleasure to welcome you to the adjustable table.
The Adjustable Table, Episode 1, Employment.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Adjustable Table. My name is Ashley Nkumsa, and I'll be helping to moderate today's conversation with my wonderful colleague here at the World Institute on Disability, Moya Shapuntov. In our work here at WID, we hope to bring the real experiences of people with disabilities into conversations about what's necessary for people with disabilities on a global scale to truly be supported, included, and celebrated. On today's episode, we're discussing employment with an outstanding group of panelists who each have an expertise in disability rights and justice, and our special guest, the incredible Haben Girma.
Haben Girma is a human rights lawyer advancing disability justice. She is the first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. President Obama named her a White House Champion of Change. She also received the Helen Keller Achievement Award, a spot on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, as well as Time 100 Talks. Also here today, we have Savannah Massey, who is Vice President of Service Delivery at IRA. She has spent 20 years of her career in the corporate space. In her current role, she provides strategic direction to scale IRA's services, meeting the growing demand for visual interpreting as an accommodation by public, private, and higher education organizations. Savannah will be speaking from her own experiences and perspective today. Lastly, we have Nicholas Love, who is the Director of Community Inclusion here at the World Institute on Disability. Nicholas focuses on systems, policies, and tools for optimizing full community inclusion of people with disabilities. Nicholas is a national speaker and advocate for diversity and social justice with over 2 decades of experience in competitive integrated employment. Nicholas is a subject matter expert on the topic of employment on a national level. Nicholas was also acknowledged as one of the 100 trans making a difference in America in 2014. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you all here.
Thank you, Moya, for that wonderful introduction. And now we know that one of the ways that we describe discrimination that people with disabilities experience is by using the term ableism. Ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people who are perceived to be disabled based on the belief that non-disabled people are superior. This is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require quote unquote fixing and that people are defined by their disabilities. Ableism can either be intentional, but it can also be unintentional and can be found in everything from our language choices, which we hear in popular phrases such as, quote, falling on deaf ears, to entire systems, including policies, education, agencies, and entire industries.
With that in mind, people with disabilities often encounter both implicit and explicit biases in the workplace due to these ableist attitudes that are so deeply ingrained. How do people with disabilities advocate for themselves when they experience ableism at work? And what can employers do to support them?
Hello, everyone. Personally, on my personal lived experience, over my journey of 20 years, I have learned that self-advocacy is not easy, but it does get over time as you build confidence and practice. So it is what I have learned personally. It's been critical to become very self-aware because you're not only advocating for your needs, but you need to be able to also show how you contribute to the success of the organization. So I needed to become more self-aware about my own disability and become more comfortable to talk about my deaf identity, my needs, and understanding my rights, being clear what type of accommodations I needed, when I needed, because I didn't want others to make decisions for me. So also practicing self assertiveness was critical. It didn't necessarily mean being aggressive and coming in and saying, here's my rights, here's what I need, but being able to vocalize what it required for me to be personally successful in the workplace. And also building that confidence came to reminding myself on a daily basis that I was not a burden, asking for tools that I needed to use to on my terms as a form of accommodation. And lastly, I realized how critical it was to utilize support and experts around me. So if I joined a new team who had never worked with a deaf individual before, leveraging access and cultural experts to come talk about deaf culture, tools and resources, how do you work with an interpreter to kind of set the tone and give everyone around me the tools to effectively navigate. I will have to say, one of the key components of this change, what companies can do, is not just drive this from a diversity and inclusion strategy, but set the culture of accessibility across the organization. More from a perspective of I'm changing the environment versus changing the individual to fit the environment that they have. Part of that change of environment includes implementing accessibility procurement standards and holding vendors accountable to rigorous standards, providing accessible website, accessible tools, whatever platform or materials, whether it's a accessible PDF or anything around the environment, including physical design of their buildings, of their offices. Really incredible important to hold vendors accountable to those standards, because once bigger organizations use their skill for good, holding vendors accountable to accessibility, it's good for everyone else. And I think it's also critically important to track progress. We all are business leaders making data-based decisions. Many companies post representation data on their website. They track gender, ethnicity, LGBTQ, veterans. Very hardly you see data posted about disability on company websites. When you post your representation data publicly, that's a form of self-accountability. That means you're going to always strive for continuous improvement and try to do better. And it does send a message whether you're truly a great place to work. And lastly, in my experience as working as a HR professional as well, I have learned there's an opportunity to educate human resource professionals as well as employment lawyers beyond compliance and truly understand how accessible tools and resources and accommodations doesn't necessarily uphold someone's native skills. It's just a platform to give them to be able to do their best job. And often those individuals or the ones in their organizations that make decisions about what types of accommodations will be approved or not approved, and their lack of awareness puts the burden on the individual with disability having to advocate and educate and create awareness versus meeting them halfway and say, here are potential tools that could be available for you, but what works for you, what your needs are, versus making decisions for them. So that would be my recommendations on importance of creating a culture of accessibility across the enterprise.
This is Nicholas. I couldn't agree more. You're just so perfectly said. I think when you're talking about putting the burden on the individual with the disability, it often, we may not even know what is available to us due to limited access to technology, due to living in poverty, due to having challenges. We won't know everything that is available to help us. So for an HR person to have that awareness would be very important, to be able to even allow us to know that, oh, there is something that would work better to be able to help me be fully there for and contribute to the workplace. And I think often employers wait until the person's in front of them to then scramble and figure out how to do it. And that causes additional stressors. It makes the employee feel like now they're being showcased and spotlighted, which could be very uncomfortable for some people. So having that information up front, right? Creating a culture that truly understands true diversity, equity, and inclusion, and doesn't just focus like, okay, we're going to do our cultural competency on disability, and this is what it means, but truly bring that into so that the employer looks like they're welcoming to people with disabilities. The people with disabilities, again, won't have that burden that you spoke of put upon them. They won't be showcased. And it also creates then an environment for those who have, the word people use a lot is hidden or invisible disabilities. I myself have, quote, air quotes, a hidden disability. And, change that language, you said very importantly, change that language to be more about apparent and non-apparent disabilities. So I have a hidden, quote, disability. It brings a shame factor to it. And then I have to out myself. And trust me, I've outed myself on enough things already. So it outs myself again, and I shouldn't have to do that. So if you have a truly inclusive environment to start with, it isn't about the person. It then brings in more of a diverse workforce that is very beneficial to the bottom line for employers. It helps those individuals that are already employed feel confident about my employer cares about me, and maybe I can get accommodations too, because I myself, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, stretched myself and did things that were damaging myself just to hide the fact that I had a disability for most of my career. And also then friends and families of people with disabilities feel they're inclusive and important. And another thought is those who acquire a disability on the job, right? Do they have to hide it now because it used to be, quote, capable, and now maybe they're not seen that way? So if we create a culture where it is fully inclusive up front and not waiting for the challenge, which I don't think it really is a challenge, to be in front of you, we could get a lot more diverse workplace and get more people that have skills and gifts to offer. I'm done.
Haben speaking now. There was some awkwardness around figuring out when I can speak and how we're moving forward. So, but that signal saying that you were done, that was super helpful, Nicholas. And I really also appreciated you centering the experiences of people in a culture where there is so much pressure to hide parts of ourselves and to appear non-disabled. There's so much pressure and images that the perfect employee is non-disabled, and that is deeply hurtful and toxic. I also really liked Savannah's points. One of them was being aware of internalized ableism. There's so much ableism in our society that sometimes we inadvertently, accidentally internalize it. So for many of us, advocacy starts out with self-advocacy and then expands to advocacy for the greater disability community. And in working on our own internalized ableism, being aware of our language is a huge part of that. Sometimes we say people with disabilities, which is in contrast with how we talk about other underrepresented groups. We say woman without having to emphasize all the time person who is a woman, person who is a man. We're comfortable just saying woman or man. So this extra work of having to trip over ourselves to emphasize person, people, I feel that actually perpetuates stigma. It requires us to do mental gymnastics whenever we're talking about disabled people. And there's been a movement for identity first language, by 2022, we should be comfortable with the fact that disabled people are people and shouldn't have to emphasize it over and over again. So why not make it easier for ourselves and just say blind people, disabled people? So there's a movement for identity first language instead of person first language. I also think it's important to recognize that there is a lot of diversity among disabled people. We disagree, we have different opinions, and that will continue. That's part of a rich culture with lots of changing ideas and new perspectives constantly coming in. So having disagreements about identity first versus person first is absolutely okay. I'm done.
Yeah, Haben, I think that is a wonderful point that you bring up, that people with disabilities are not a monolith. And I think that this panel is such a great example of that, how we all have so many different unique perspectives that we can all bring to the table to share. And yeah, I just really appreciate you bringing the fact that people with disabilities are a rich tapestry of, human beings. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. And we discussed earlier how ableism can exist in systems, and many workplaces often alienate disabled people by having ableist stipulations such as requiring heavy lifting or quote excellent communication skills, or coming into the office even when work can be done remotely, inaccessible career portals, and or punishing employees for taking too much time off of work. And all of these often cause disabled people to live with incredible fear of losing their jobs and the associated health benefits. What would change this for people with disabilities? And we can start with Nicholas.
Thank you. This is Nicholas. So I've experienced this. I was born with my disability, but it hasn't been apparent most of my life. And I myself was told I was, quote, fixed through the medical abuse that I received as a child, so I could walk. So I hid my disability and was very fearful of employers knowing about my disability because I would be seen as weak. And as a trans man, I always had to try to be more masculine, be strong. And I was very fearful that I would be seen as weak and that people would use my disability as an excuse to fire me because I am trans. And so I had a job working within the disability world, and I was told I was taking too much time off, and that if I was sick and I needed to call off, I needed to at least come to the office first and wait for my supervisor to show up. So I literally drug myself to the office, laid on my desk, and waited an hour for him to come in and go, okay, you can go home. Well, the point was, it was getting to the workplace that was my challenge. It was getting up and knowing that if my legs were going to work, if my pain levels were too high, and I couldn't share that for fear that I would be fired, not only because of the disability, but they would use that as the reason. Like, look, he can't show up to work, and they'd fire me because I'm trans. So there was that discriminative feeling. I didn't understand, why we had to fit certain criteria for jobs. I've worked a lot with helping other people get employed, and there's ridiculous requirements. I worked as a case manager, and we couldn't hire a case manager unless they had a car. I'm like, well, the client can get to us on the bus. Why can't we get to them on the bus? But you couldn't be hired unless you had a car and could drive yourself. And these are ridiculous, archaic structures that we need to really look at. What do you want from the person? Not what does the job description say. What do you want from the person? And can the person offer that? And does the person need assistance to offer it? Fine. Get the right person. A $50 accommodation is much better than having the wrong person who can drive. So I'm done.
So yes, just as Nicholas was saying, we need to review our job descriptions and ask ourselves, what do we actually need from the individual in the role, rather than what have we traditionally expected from the person in the role? Because there's a lot of difference. Maybe you traditionally had someone who drives around. If you need the person to move around, that doesn't necessarily mean you need them to drive. They could get around through public transport or having a driver to transport them or using rideshare taxis. So every traditional expectation for an employee needs to be re-examined under the lens of what's an alternative way of doing this? Can we be just as happy having these alternative methods used in this role? So review the job descriptions. Look for ableism. Look for those assumptions you're making about how people should do the job, when in fact they can do it in an alternative and just as effective way. I'm done.
This is Savannah speaking. Just to add on to the points of Haben and Nicholas, I think on top of all this, it's critical for businesses who are creating these rules within organization or hiring, from talent acquisition to human resources to workforce planning individuals, really understanding when we're talking about diversity. Disability is diversity. And when we are looking to tap into our workforce and bring diversity to the table, how does this work? And then on the entire process, how we tap into this talented pool of individuals who have so much to contribute to. I know for a fact so many times personally see a job description that says need to be able to speak, read, write, with strong reading and writing and speaking skills. But I have engaged with many people who are completely able to hear and speak, and they don't necessarily have great communication skills. So it is critical to be able to say we're looking for candidates with great communication skills. That may vary about how that will show up for many people. But their lack of awareness in the systems of their organizations have in place is part of the issue that exists today and the mindset. So oftentimes I have said, what would a job description look like if it was written by an individual with disability? So we don't have representations of people with disabilities working. We do, but they're not necessarily, disclosing their disability in human resources, in finance, in talent acquisition, and all across the organization. If there was people with disabilities represented and they had to sit at the table to contribute, job descriptions today and across many organizations will look very different than you typically see. So I think another component of this work in terms of systemic perspective, many organizations today are discussing system change from racial perspective and feel, oh, well, we're talking about this. At some point, we will get to talk about the case for disability inclusion. And I think that that's a work that needs to happen in parallel. All system evaluation, not one or the other, or which one gets a priority. It's not disability community. It's one marginalized community that anyone can join at any time. So just because currently today you as an individual are not experiencing it does not mean you will not at some point in your life. So I think one area of opportunity that we have as systemic change across many companies is that you don't truly have to empathize or experience those to care about this topic and care about this issue. So I think that's a critical piece of integrating accessibility culture across the organization. And when we talk about the business case for disability inclusion, it would be great we could get past and talking about the business case rather than focusing on what's the right thing to do, how are we tapping into this broader talent pool to make our brands and products and business operations more inclusive for everyone. I'm done here.
This is Nicholas. I love that. And I'd like to add something that just popped in my head while we were talking. I could hear, say, an employer listening to this going, oh, now I got to do one more thing. I got to look at it through one more lens. And really, it's not an additional, it's not instead of. If you looked at the job of what do I want at the end, what is the purpose of this job and what is necessary to actually accomplish this job, and started at what do I want to help my business move forward, then individuals would have the ability to be more expansive with how they can carry that out. And there could actually be someone with a disability or not that can actually look at that job differently and accomplish it in a more effective way that would actually help the business, as opposed to a person who's been doing it a while and they're like, this is what the job takes, right? What is your end goal? And if you started a job description at the end goal and allowed the individual to tell you how they would achieve that goal, you would get more of a diversity within the disability community. You would get more of a racial equity, because we know there's inequity in education, etc. There's a lot of different ways. So it's just something I saw an employer going, one more thing I have to do. No, stop looking through all the lenses and look at what are the end jobs with the awareness that Savannah was talking about. It would be a very different world. I'm done.
Thank you for that, Nicholas. I think it's very clear that we're needing that very different world now. And so it's just a matter of how we get there. We're starting to see COVID protections are being lifted. People aren't wearing their face masks. Widespread testing and remote work are starting to be rolled back. And, we have leaders saying that the pandemic is over. How is this leaving disabled workers behind?
Haben speaking. Disabled workers are very diverse. There are some disabled workers who are celebrating no masks and who don't believe COVID ever really was a thing. And then there are other disabled people who are at risk of losing their lives if they catch COVID, or if they catch COVID and the healthcare system decides not to give them quality of care due to deeply systemic medical ableism. So there's a lot of diversity within the disability community, lots of different views on masking and vaccination. I do feel a lot of disabled people, especially those who are immune compromised, are frustrated with many people acting like the pandemic is over, and many people no longer masking, especially on transportation and in large group public settings, because it puts disabled people who are immune compromised at greater risk. And disabled people should be able to move freely and attend these large gathering events and be able to take public transportation without putting their lives in danger. It's also really important that as we move forward, hybrid virtual options continue to be options. There are some organizations that have stopped doing virtual options and are only doing in-person, and that excludes people who would not be able to attend otherwise. So we've learned a lot of lessons in the pandemic. Hang on to that wisdom. Don't abandon that wisdom now. I'm done.
Thank you so much for that. This is Nicholas speaking. I am someone who has a compromised immune system, and it scares me. I still can't. I'm not comfortable to go to the grocery store. Where I live, wearing a mask actually causes me to be a target, a political target, where I could get hurt, to be very brutally honest. And as a small trans man with a disability, I have enough targets. So wearing a mask, I get harassed. I just had to travel for my job. I should not have to put my life at risk to do my job. But I needed to go on a plane, and there was very few people wearing a mask. And so it's the belief structure that this is over. It's not over. This virus did not go away because we became tired of it. This virus continues, and there are those who did acquire COVID, myself twice, who now are dealing with long haul COVID, where I'm having challenges with my memory, my fatigue. It has expedited my disability by probably 10 years. And I feel like I can't share that because then again, I'm weak. I'm not capable. And we do have to hold those lessons because we've learned so much. People with disabilities are often isolated from the rest of society. And when the world shut down for brief periods, people without disabilities got a taste of what it meant to be isolated. They have to remember what that feels like, because there are still people with disabilities that has been their whole life. It has not just been 2.5 years. It's been their whole life of non-inclusion. We learned how to communicate. We learned how to pivot very quickly and become a truly virtual world. And now we can't just let that go, because not only did it create an opportunity for us to all talk to each other, but the technology of virtualism, the technology of sharing actually created a more inclusive communication. People who never could go to a conference before could go. People who were never part of a conversation suddenly had the opportunity to be present because they were at home with Zoom. We have learned we can work differently, and we can't return to, quote, normal, because the normal didn't work. It wasn't, oh, goody, you got to wear your slippers while you worked. For us, it's a little bit more involved than just I get to wear my jammies and my slippers while I work, right? It's I now get to work. So I'll be done there because I can go on. So I'm done.
To add to that, Nicholas, I love to talk about what we cannot do before. For me personally, I thought it was really fascinating to see when masks became a widely used request among everyone in the early stages of pandemic. Many people with hearing loss will complain about their ability to communicate and frustrations with masks. And I realized it was never about the mask. It's because people with hearing loss have always taken on the full responsibility in communication the entire time. And now people who were wearing masks were beginning to empathize and understand because they who could hear are struggling with hearing and conversation. And it challenged people from just removing their mask and saying, can you read my lips? Because for their own health and safety, they did not want to remove their masks. Well, so what it did, it changed this behavior of, I'm going to write, I'm going to gesture, I'm going to use assistive technology, texting, I'm going to tap on my phone. And so for me, I think the silver lining here was people start to learn to understand what shared responsibility in communication look like. And as now that masks are not widely used, I see people continue with those behaviors and habits instead of falling back on like, oh yeah, can you read my lips again? And for me personally, going from a in-office role to a 100% remote experience was extremely positive, because I was all of a sudden didn't have to worry about what was that little huddle that was happening at the end of the office, what was that water cooler chat that was happening in the kitchen that I was missing out on. And those are moments that you get to know people, build relationship, and you're missing out on information. So now that we're going to a hybrid model, more and more companies are doing, half time in the office, come back and continue work remotely or 100% remote. One thing that it's a note topic of conversation now is that leaders need to become more aware about their proximity bias. It is known that many times leaders have a tendency to prefer and show favorism or give preferential treatment to employees who are closest to them physically. This adds another complexity of layers. So we've been fighting so hard to get access to a job. So remote now is giving us an opportunity to enter the workforce. And now I'm in the workforce and I'm contributing to the success of the organization. Now I have to figure out how to navigate this proximity bias so it doesn't hinder me from my development in the future. What I love about my current role at IRA is that every single person across the organization is remote and we're placed all over the world, which creates this equal access that I don't feel I'm missing out on a proximity bias, in addition to my ability to grow and contribute to the organization. So I think many of us we're going back to work. It's made it really clear after the pandemic when there was a survey done and research and studies showed that 80% of people wanted to continue to work from remotely from home. And we need to start looking at remote work more of a tool like an assistive technology versus it's a preferential choice of what that individual wants and does not want. It's so critical to allow people and empower them on their terms, allowing them to continue to choose a workspace that meets their need. It's really known that people of color and people with disabilities continue to experience ableism and discrimination at work. So when you're in an office environment, the engagement that you have, the interaction that you have with people going to work remotely kind of creates the protection for you that you don't have to be exposed to those things on a day-to-day basis. And remote work is doing wonders for the community, those who can access, and I think it should be the norm, or at least given a continuous option. If someone chooses to work remotely, that could be something that they choose to do as long as they want to. So continuing empower workforce on their terms versus making decisions for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you all bring up incredible points about there's so many lessons that we have all learned over the past 2.5 years that it's been since COVID has started. And it's not about moving past all of that. It's about moving forward with that knowledge and creating a more inclusive and accessible society for people with disabilities, because for so many years that hasn't been the case. And I would love to also hear from you all, what has surprised you the most as you have navigated employment and your career development as disabled people? And I would love to start with you, Nicholas.
This is Nicholas. One of the things is that's kind of shocked me and quite frankly upset me is this hierarchy of disability, of how internal discrimination within the disability community, and how, with me having not apparent disabilities, I've been told I wasn't really disabled. I haven't had the challenges of somebody who perhaps is utilizing a wheelchair or has a sensory disability. And I've been treated like I don't belong. We do this a lot within the mental health community. A lot of people in the mental health community are like, I don't have a disability, right? And people, afraid to admit they had a disability. I did not admit my disability till I was in my 40s and well in my disability career, despite the fact I was born with it, and it is a progressive as I age. It shocks me that we have this hierarchy, that, someone's better than someone else because they have a more significant, I have always hated that word, significant disability. Any type of disability or challenge is significant when you're experiencing it. Even if it's not directly related to a disability, any challenge is significant if you're the one experiencing it. So that is the part that's kind of shocked me, is that belief structure, that internal fighting. I do disability benefits, and one of the only disability benefit that is different is for people who are blind, for blind people. And I constantly get asked why. And I'm like, better lobbying. But really what it is that we have such an internal fight of my disability is more important than yours, so that we don't work together to actually create a more inclusive community. And not only does that surprise me, it saddens me deeply. I'm done.
So for me, what really surprised me, but didn't surprise me, is how often individuals determine my skill and my ability based on the fact that I'm using my voice as a deaf person. So because I use my voice, I must be smarter. I must be more talented, and that was a stereotype that I had to deal with pretty frequently. The other component of surprise for me was I wasn't invited to be at the table, but when it was an opportunity to showcase the organizations were committed to disability inclusion, to be able to tokenize and say, I'm checking that box, I have this deaf person, so that means I'm doing my job. That was another component of a surprise in the journey. But what I learned most importantly in this, my 20-year of career navigating, is how critical it was for me to be self-aware and be very clear about my strengths and opportunities, because I had to do two things. I had to, break down the stereotypes of what deaf person cannot do. On top of that, prove that I am competent, smart, capable of demonstrating the job duties. And based on that, I learned it was so critical for me to be able to say, here is how I contributed to the organization's success, assessing where I had opportunities and actively working on those opportunities, because there was also sometimes the experiences of not getting clear and direct and constructive feedback because, oh, poor people with disabilities, they're trying their best. We have them here, let's check that box, and this is where you're going to stay. And many times I had to explain about what was possible, what actually made me more qualified than a non-disabled individual in the application process and the work. But we all know elevating awareness is half the battle. And once you can continue to educate and elevate awareness on this topic, it's not easy. It takes a lot of emotional talks. You sometimes want to be able to enter workforce, do your work, and end your day just like anyone else, and not having to educate and advocate for everyone. But I've realized in this journey as well is that every time I became exhausted with over explaining an advocacy component, I had to remember that I wanted the future generation to have better experiences than we've had. So I took responsibility to continue that level of awareness. With awareness comes intentionality. So the more we continue to educate, the better experiences will be. So I'm optimistic about the future generation who are today using social media such as TikTok and Instagram and stories on Facebook to truly showcase their contributions and change their mindsets and attitudes.
Haben speaking. I absolutely agree and have had similar experiences of people making assumptions about me based on my voice. And the fact that many people associate clear speaking with intelligence is ableist. And it's deeply hurtful for people who have speech and communication disabilities, accents, use computer assisted devices for communication. There's a whole list, very, very long list of different lived experiences that are hurt by this ableist bias. So when I encounter it, I try to use my privilege to remind people this is not right, and we need to create spaces for all different kinds of voices, whether it's a voice with an accent or if someone is signing or using augmented communication. Another thing that has really surprised me in my work as a disability advocate is the expectation that disabled people can only be white, or only white disabled experiences deserve advocacy. There have been many times when I've asked a disability organization, we need to talk about Black Lives Matter. We need to talk about disabled people of color who are experiencing multiple forms of oppression. And the response is often, we're working on disability issues. There are disabled people of color. Our issues are also disability issues. But racism and ableism often intersect, and unfortunately, this also comes up in disability organizations. So that surprised and upset me, and that came up a lot during the pandemic. I am done.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Is there something you wanted to add, Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is here we are trying to do our jobs, and the exhaustion of having to do another full-time job of educating not only our employers, but the world and society in general of who we are. As Haben said, is we can't just check a box. We can't just be one thing. We must look at the full picture of a human being. We are not just disabled people. I am not just a person with a physical disability, right? I'm not just a trans man. I'm not just et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where we can look at the social justice, the social impact of inclusion. And we must look at that inclusion very differently. We can't just look at our own lens, right? But we can't fix all the problems at the same time. And so one of the things that really I see a lot is this siloed approach, not only because of race, disability, et cetera, but again, back to that silo of your disability versus my disability. And that's why we don't have inclusion. I'm done.
Absolutely. Ultimately, what disability justice teaches is that if we are listening to and really attending to the needs of people who are the most marginalized in a space, then everyone benefits, as opposed to, when we just cater to the needs of the loudest, whitest person with a disability in the room, because that only benefits them.
Yes.
And just amplifies the hurt. We want to make sure we get to our last question. For many people with disabilities, accommodations can make it possible to work, but not everyone has that experience. So if equity means everyone gets what they need, does that mean everyone needs to have a job? If not, what needs to be done to better support disabled people who are not able to work? And I'll go ahead and start with you, Nicholas. I know you have strong feelings about this.
Yes, I do. This is Nicholas. I am a strong believer of employment first philosophy, and that employment first philosophy is that all people with disabilities can work, and work should be the first opportunity given to all people with disabilities. We shouldn't have to prove it. It should just be the given opportunity. Now, I know that some people will say, but my disability is significant. By the way, I hate that word again. But it is about the limitations of our society, not the limitations of the individual. The individual is able to contribute. People with disabilities, we are able to contribute to society. And if we're able to contribute to society, which we are, then we can actually work. The challenge has been that we look at what is work as one particular thing. We don't look at the diversity of the skills and gifts that people have and what that can actually create. I always talk about each person has a skill, a gift, something of worth to offer. Now let's figure out how to help them make a profit on it. That's called employment. And so I know people who do not speak, who do not have the ability to speak, and they're public speakers for a living. I know lawyers who don't speak, who utilize, only their eyes to be able to move their equipment, and they have people who speak with them and have personal assistants. It's about looking at what is necessary to support each person in their dream, not this is the type of job a person with a disability can get. I often get that. Who hires people with disabilities? Everyone hires people with disabilities when they see that they fulfill their job needs. right? So it is about everyone has the opportunity. It is about, though, how our society looks at it and puts those particular barriers up that we talked about earlier about what is a job accommodation. I work with helping people get work, and I've worked in that position. And vocational rehab may look at somebody and say they're unemployable. They're not unemployable. You're just not willing to look at it differently. You're not willing to stress your job, to take that challenge on your job, to look at a perspective differently of what this person can contribute. Moya, you know I can go on this for days, so I'm going to stop there and bring up, well, I'm not going to stop there. I lied. I'm going to bring up the second question, which was, what do we do for those who can't? Right? Because I know that the discussion will be about those who have limited hours, who limited ability to work simply for, for me. I know that sometimes I don't have enough energy to do an 8-hour day. So how do I do that? What to be able to make my means? And that really goes back to, again, a system change. When we have a system that has a minimum wage of $7.25 on a federal level, that is not a livable wage. And we have this inequity of different states having different belief structures of what is a livable wage. When we have Medicaid and equity, when one state can offer Medicaid and another state doesn't offer a Medicaid, with a different resource limit, we put income limits on people that then keeps them in poverty. And we cannot keep people in poverty and make them hurt themselves to even try to make a daily living. So I'm going to stop there for real. I'm done.
Haben speaking. All three of us have found and experienced employment. A big part of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. I think it's not fair for us to make decisions about disabled people who have not been able to find employment, given that we would be speaking for people very different from ourselves. And it's important that they be part of these conversations regarding how do we create a new system, a solution for people who have not been able to work in this very ableist and system with so many other barriers in addition to ableism. I'm done.
Just want to add on, Haben and Nicholas made some great points. I also want to add a lot of these perceptions in starts from the top to bottom. Oftentimes we try to make a systemic change from bottom up, and that's really challenging. And so the perception of what is considered a workforce or a talent, or how do we capture that market, it starts from the top. I'm currently reporting to a CEO who's every day advocating for this. Despite not having the lived experience, you don't need to have the lived experience to empathize and see the need and the value of the disability community contributing to the success of an organization. And it's really the life-changing experience to not having to build a business case on what's possible, and that everyone needs to be able to work. It makes a huge impact positively on someone's work environment, where you come in and top down leaders are committed to these efforts and see the value. Unless someone chooses not to work, that's a personal choice, but there's always a possible way someone can contribute to the organization's success.
Thank you for those thoughts. I think especially as we are dealing with this huge wave of people who have had COVID and are now dealing with long COVID, we're going to face this question more and more. So I think there's some really powerful truth in what you're all saying of, one, we have to make it possible for people to work. And two, we also have to make it possible for people to not work, because we all need to be able to be housed, to have food on the table, to have our needs met, regardless of what's going on. And I think those things will really help us to be able to access those talents and skills that we all know are there.
So this is Nicholas. there's so much systems change that needs to happen. We're living in a very imperfect world. And when we start looking at the whole of it, the holistic approach, we'll realize that by inclusion, we're actually bettering all of humanity as opposed to just my personal life. And we really don't have to do too much differently if we look at things that way, because it's about who needs to be there, how big is my table, and if it's too small and everybody's not there, then let's just get rid of the table and everyone just share and move this forward. We look so much, at the political aspects of employment. When you really look at it, it's very political. And, Social Security reform is necessary. Straight out. Medicaid is necessary. All human beings deserve dignity. And so we need to be able to look at it that way. This employment to me is truly a social justice issue across all types of humans. And that's why I came to this work, is because of the social justice aspect. And I truly believe that for people to be fully inclusive in society, they need to have the means to do so. They need to have money. And so we have to be able to give people the opportunity to make the choices that work for them. And those choices should not be based on basically trying to survive. They should be based on choice, right? People shouldn't have to work multiple jobs to make their means. And people shouldn't have to go on benefits if they can go to work. It's societal barriers that are in the way. And so if we can break down and look at who do we want in the workforce, what do we need? Personal belief, we need everyone. We need everyone to contribute. And if they choose not to contribute through actual employment, that's their choice. But it shouldn't be their choice because the system's in their way. It shouldn't be their choice because of, just basic survival. So when we talk about employment first, it's not that everyone has to work. Everyone has to have the opportunity to make that choice for themselves. I'm done.
Absolutely. And I think that's an amazing point to end on. I think that's a great point that you bring up, is systems change. That is what we so desperately need. And I think that all three of you are doing such incredible work to make that a reality. And we obviously still have a long ways to go. But I think that this conversation has been a great step in that direction of, fostering that mindset of, yes, we need systems to be completely transformed. And I think, again, over these past 2.5 years during the pandemic, we've learned that now more than ever, that needs to happen. So I want to thank you all for this amazing, thought-provoking conversation. This was so amazing. I learned a lot just listening to you all. So thank you so much for that. And I want to thank you all at home as well for joining us for today's episode of The Adjustable Table. You can find transcripts for this episode in the description box down below. And if you would like to join us, our next episode, we will be discussing healthcare access with the wonderful Imani Barbarin. So thank you all once again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you to panelists Savannah Massa, Nicholas Love, and Haben Girma, moderators and producers Ashley Nkumsa and Moya Shbantoff, editing Moya Shbantoff. Special thanks to Carrie Griffin Bassis, Carmen Daniels-Jones, Deborah Daggett, Jenny Lehrer-Stein, Karen Tamley, Kathy Martinez, Catherine Seelman, Marcy Roth, Megan Mani, Megan Kennedy, Sarah Helm, Sarah Pash, Susan Mazrui, Susan Siegel, Tally Bray, Michelle Lantini, and Reggie Johnson. Thank you to Wells Fargo for your generous support of this series and your longstanding partnership with WID.